Well, what do you think of when you think of democracy? People voting. Okay, and what do you think of when you think of republicanism? People voting as well. How many people do you imagine get to vote in a democratic form of government? Everybody in an ideal world, right? In a pure democracy, everybody gets to vote. And there are some models for this throughout world history. In some Swiss principalities, whenever a policy or a law comes up to vote, they have a referendum. Everybody comes out and votes for it, right? We have referendums sometimes in state politics today, right? That's a more democratic form of government, right? What's a Republican form of government? Okay, absolutely. Not everybody necessarily gets to vote. More people get to vote, certainly than under a monarchy or an oligarchy, right, where you just have like a handful of people who make these decisions, or a theocracy where sort of religious elites make these decisions. In a Republican form of government, the people are the center of government, but not necessarily all of the people, right? Republicanism was the form of government that the Founding Fathers envisioned and created when they formed and ratified the Constitution of 1787. And republicanism suggested that only those who were qualified to participate in government should participate in government. And qualifications meant, as you suggested, you own land, you have a certain amount of property. Because if you don't own your own land and you don't own your own property, people thought that meant you were dependent on somebody else for your money and for your job and for your livelihood. And if you were dependent on somebody else for these things, did that mean that you could truly be independent? Right? Or were you just going to vote whatever the person paying your paycheck told you to vote? These are some of the concerns that the Founding Fathers had. They were worried, in other words, that democracy might form a type of government in which people who didn't necessarily have either the wealth or the education to participate in government might seize control of power. Under a Republican form of government, the idea was you wanted people who were supposedly disinterested, who didn't necessarily, weren't necessarily thinking, were able at least to think of what was in the public good outside of just their own interest. Right? This is what republicanism, as opposed to democracy, stressed. And as a result, until the 1810s, in most states, there remained property requirements for you to be able to vote. If you didn't have a certain amount of property, you weren't able to vote. Now, I've suggested to you then that the Founding Fathers didn't set out to create a democratic form of government. They set out to create a Republican form of government. When was the last time you had a class that talked about the Constitution? You talked about it a little yesterday, didn't you? The U.S. Constitution? What are some elements of the U.S. Constitution that suggest that James Madison, right, the supposed architect of it, and he had a lot of help, didn't set out to form a democratic form of government, but a Republican one? You just know anything about the Constitution? What are some of the instances of that? Yeah. The Electoral College. That's not at one vote. Each person gets a vote, right? The Electoral College puts a lot of distance, in fact. And certainly during that day, when most electors weren't chosen by people going to the polls. They were chosen by state legislatures who would get together and say, okay, here's who we're going to support for president. And now we don't have that anymore. Now we go to the polls, and then, though it doesn't necessarily have to be this way, an elector could decide to say, well, I'm not going to support whoever the people of my state voted for. If they did, they probably would be lots of court battles at this state. But back then, the people didn't really vote for the president. Right? Certainly in 1788. Or in 1792. Okay? The Electoral College is a good example of that. Any other examples of that? Yeah.
Slavery was not abolished, so then the black people were abolished.
Absolutely. Right? We have to remember that in the context of this time, slavery within the Constitution, though the word's never mentioned in there, there's lots of different references to the institution. The Constitution preserved, to a great extent, the institution of slavery. Right? That's not a democratic value. And yet it remained a central. And not only did it remain central, but people who had slaves could count those slaves whenever they decide, even though slaves couldn't vote, right? Could count those slaves, or 3/5 of them, 3/5 clause, in determining how many representatives they had in Congress. You could argue, and some did at the time, that slave owners were being rewarded with extra votes for having slaves. That's far from a democratic institution. Anything else in the Constitution that you can look at and say, maybe they didn't really see democracy as being the answer to politics?
The fact that the judges were appointed and not...
Okay, appointed judges, absolutely. Federal judges appointed by whom? By the president. By the president. Now, in state-level judges, well, that would be an issue that you probably talked about yesterday in Ohio, right? Because some people thought this was wrong, or weren't as high on this idea. All of these, and there could be others that we turn to, suggest that the Constitution of 1787 was not intended to be a democratic document. And as I've said, this is because those who created it feared the idea of democracy. So now, how is it we get from that idea to, by the 1830s, democracy being a term that didn't cause people to sort of run and hide? Democracy being an idea that people said, this is a good idea. We like the idea of more democracy. How do we get to that point? Well, in part, some within the U.S. believed that that always should have been what the Constitution was about. Expanding liberty and freedom to more people. Who especially might be making that argument? That they should get to have all of the same rights as other people who did have power, who could be elected to government. Who might be making the argument that more democracy is a good thing? Women could be making that argument, and a few kind of suggested that at this time. Abigail Adams, most famously, wrote a letter to her husband where she said, don't forget the ladies. Have you heard of this letter? You know what John Adams' response was? Abigail, my dear, the next thing you're going to tell me is that slaves should be able to vote, and that Native Americans should be able to have power, which suggests how limited and how male-centered understandings of democracy were at this time. But some women were making this case, and increasingly so by the mid-19th century. Who else might be making this claim that maybe more rather than less democracy is good?
Those who didn't own land.
Those who didn't own land. Including some who fought during the American Revolution, right? They fought as soldiers to help create this country, but they maybe didn't have the money to own land, and they weren't able to vote. That, they argued, was not fair. And they would appeal towards the idea that they should be able to vote as well.